Good evening, everybody. Hope everyone's doing well. Just a side note, having nothing to do with anything. One of the things my wife and I like to do is to do some random walking tours, self-guided walking tours in the city in Yerushalayim, the neighborhoods that we've been in the neighborhood. So today we did one a couple hours in Romema behind the Tachane Merkazit. Been by the area probably 400 million times, no exaggeration. Never explored back there. And it's just fascinating buildings and history, and highly recommend something that's a little nugget right in your backyard. Okay, having nothing to do with anything. I want to, where we left off last week, we had just mentioned Hitler's beer hall putsch. Many people are familiar with it, they've heard of it, don't know the details. So I have a video here from Khan Academy. If you're familiar with it, that's really nice. If you're not, they're amazing. Free education, truly free education. And I'm going to play this, a 6-minute video, and then we'll talk about it afterwards just briefly, and then we're going to move on. And it's important at this point, even though Hitler's way before coming to power, and we're not going to talk much about Hitler for a while, this is a nugget or a seed that's been planted for the future.
1923, Hitler sees it as his chance to seize power in Germany. And he's getting this popularity. The Nazis are getting this followership because the Weimar Republic is falling apart. You have the hyperinflation. The German people feel insulted by this French occupation of the Ruhr region. And it isn't just regular people who are starting to support the Nazis. It's very notable people as well. This right over here is General Ludendorff. We've already talked about him as one of the believers in the stab in the back theory that Germany would have won World War I if it wasn't stabbed in the back.
We're going to talk about that tonight, the stab in the back theory, which I mentioned briefly last week. We're going to talk about it tonight. Bezrat Hashem.
By the November criminals who had taken control of the government during the revolution in October and November. He becomes a supporter of Hitler as well. In 1922, you have Mussolini come to power. This inspires Hitler. So as we get into November, Hitler sees this as his chance, and the way that he wants to take control is he wants to abduct or kidnap the leaders of the Bavarian region, and there's 3 of them in particular at this time, and then from there try to take control of the nation as a whole. And so in November of 1923, you have a gathering of the 3 gentlemen who are essentially in charge of Bavaria, a gathering of them and several thousand officials in Bavaria at a local beer hall in Munich. At a beer hall. And Hitler sees this as the opportunity to take control. So this is where he launches his beer hall Putsch. And I know I'm mispronouncing it, but Putsch literally means coup d'etat, to try to overthrow the government. And so Hitler and his Nazis, they go to that beer hall meeting of the government officials. They surround it with their paramilitary group, their stormtroopers. Hitler enters into the hall, gets on stage, shoots into the air twice, and says, look, this is the revolution. It is beginning. He forces the 3 leaders of Bavaria at gunpoint to pledge allegiance to the Nazi party and to this putsch and to Hitler in particular. But then things start to go a little bit start to dissolve as Hitler tries to address some issues that are going on outside. The members who they were going to kidnap are allowed to leave. You have chaos in the area amongst the Nazis and frankly amongst the government throughout that evening into that morning, at which point Hitler and his followers, and Ludendorff is one of them, decide to march into central Munich. All of this is happening in Munich, which is in Bavaria. They decide to march, and it's during that march that they have a confrontation with the official government troops. And it's unclear who fired the first shot, but you do have an exchange of fire. And during that exchange of fire, I've seen estimates of about 14 to 16 Nazis are shot. A few days later, and a few policemen or a few soldiers are shot as well. And then a few days later, Hitler is arrested. Hitler is arrested. He's tried in early 1924, and then he is sentenced to jail. So all of his ambitions were kind of led to nothing. But in jail, he still continued to develop his philosophy, and he actually continued to develop his following. So he spent roughly the second 2/3 of 1924. In 1924, he spent it in jail. 1924 was spent primarily in jail, but while he was in jail, he dictated his autobiography and frankly, his belief system in Mein Kampf, which literally means my struggle. And it's actually banned in many countries. It's not banned in the U.S. But it does make for interesting reading, because you get a sense for, on one level, how bizarre Hitler's brain was and how disturbed Hitler's brain was. But on the other side, you can appreciate that he was a strong communicator. Even before any of this, people would talk about how transfixing his eyes were, how much attention people paid to him when he would give a speech. But you can even see this in his writing, and you can do a web search on it, and you can get the entire text of Mein Kampf. And it's disturbing and fascinating at the same time. But this is a little passage, and in this passage, it gives you an idea of Hitler's view of why Germany was having these failures, and what he, in his bizarrely disturbed mind, thought what the solution was. If we pass all the causes of the German collapse in review, the ultimate and most decisive remains the failure to recognize the racial problem, and especially the Jewish menace. So he's blaming all of Hitler's difficulties on a racial problem, and in particular on Jews. The defeats on the battlefield in August 1918 would have been child's play to bear. They stood in no proportion to the victories of our people. It was not they that caused our downfall. No, it was brought about by that power which prepared these defeats by systematically over many decades robbing our people of the political and moral instincts and forces which alone make nations capable and hence worthy of existence. And if you read a lot of the other texts, what he's talking about is this decades of essentially watering down their society with other people. If they didn't water it down, they say the defeats in the battlefield would have been child's play to bear. In heedlessly ignoring the question of the preservation of the racial foundations of our nation, the Old Reich disregarded the sole right which gives life in this world. So he views this in his mind, racial impurity as the reason why Hitler was the reason why Germany was facing all of this difficulty. And as we'll see over the next few videos, this leads to one of the ugliest and bloodiest periods of human history.
Okay, so we stop sharing. So I showed that, first of all, because it's important for someone who is not me to give you a little bit of a summary that's better than I would have done. And in addition to that, another reason. You'll notice it's 1923. It's in 1924. He writes Mein Kampf and My Struggle, which he basically, as was just mentioned, lays out his plan. His struggle. What is his struggle? The Jews becoming the main menace, racial purity. That's the whole book. Over history, especially since even before Hitler, our enemies have said and written very clearly what their goals are. 100%. When Arafat Yamach Shemo, when Hamas comes to power, when the Islamic Jihad comes to power, when ISIS. Everything's in writing. They have a charter. The charter is not what the world calls the two-state solution, or what we call the two-state final solution. It's not that. That's not what they want. They want one state, and they're willing to murder every single Jew, and they tell you that 100% very clearly up front. And the Western mind doesn't get that. When you see that back then, and you see it today, it's the same thing. So the reason I'm mentioning a little bit more than just a couple sentences at this point in the class on the Beer Hall Putsch is because it plays such a very significant role coming up in his philosophy and what eventually, of course, happens later on. So what I want to do is just talk a little bit about the German Jews in the Weimar Republic. First of all, the Weimar Republic, why is it called that? In the city of Weimar in central Germany, after World War I and the fall of the German Empire, the National Assembly met in Weimar in 1919 to write the new democratic constitution. So that's something we already talked about, but I didn't mention why it was called Weimar. So that's why it's named after the city where it began. So what about the Jews in the Weimar Republic? What was going on with them? So for the German Jews there, it represented something fairly new for the Jews because the state really removed most of the last legal barriers to full participation in German life. Under the empire, prior to World War I, the Jews have been formally equal citizens, but the Jews in history, it's always but. The Jews have gotten this, but they can do this, but. And what was the but when it came to the empire before World War I? They were excluded from Reserve Officer Corps. They were the high positions in civil service were closed to them. The aristocratic world was closed to them. Pretty much social mixing in social German social world. Like, that's too many socials in there. Was off limits to them. That was before World War I. The Republic, the Weimar Republic, changed this, and the results are pretty immediate, pretty clear. Jewish representation in cultural and intellectual life in Weimar Germany was absolutely extraordinary. Now, we of course have the unfortunate. I'll explain why I'm saying unfortunate. The unfortunate, um, um, whatever the word is, that we have. We know the history. We know what eventually happens. And the reason I say that's unfortunate is because when we talk about history, the best thing to do is try to do two things. One is to see how things started and how they transpired, where they started, where they transpired and grew. And the other is to try to focus on that time without the preconceived notions of what is eventually going to happen. In a very similar fashion, but lahavdil, when a person looks at, I've said this for many years, I'm blue in the face. And it's not an original idea at all. When a person wants to learn a pasuk or a parak in Tanakh, one of the best things to do is to start with fresh eyes. You look at a pasuk, forget about what you know about the word Breshit, the pasuk Breshit bara Elokim et hashamayim v'et haaretz. Forget what you know about V'zot habracha asher beirach Moshe lifnei moto. Forget about all the things you may know. Put it aside and look at it as if you're seeing the pasuk for the first time. Where you can really try something like that, and I've done this in school many times, is Mishnah. You take a random Mishnah, look at it, and say all the potential questions you can come up with on that Mishnah. And then if you have the ability to go into the Gemara, you'll see how many of those questions the Gemara deals with. So it's a mental exercise. The things that we're more familiar with, the less we tend to look at just what's the pshat, what's the pasuk telling us. Things we're less familiar. Open up Sefer Amos, okay, or Chavakuk, which most people don't read on a regular basis. And pick out a pasuk, look at the translation, and you're literally starting from Ephes. You're starting from zero. The same thing is true, lahavdil, when it comes to history. When we look at things just through a little hole like that, through what do you call it, with the blinders on, we could say that, look, the beginning of the Weimar Republic for the Jews was absolutely fantastic. Albert Einstein, who was already internationally famous for his theory of relativity, writing the most famous equation in history, E equals mc squared, which is energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. C represents the speed of light. Speed of light is 186,000 miles per second. Light can travel around the world 25 times in 1 second. This is all Einstein. This is all his. He's already well known and probably the most celebrated scientist for sure until his time, and even possibly till this today. There are many important scientists. There are other people who are publishing books in medicine, in law, in journalism, in theater, in film, in music, natural sciences. In every single layer of the world of knowledge, German Jews created, contributed well beyond their disproportionate numbers. And again, this is a story that repeats itself. The percentage of German Jews to the amount of Germans who were not Jewish was I'll say it, 0.7%. There are about 500,000 Jews at this point in Germany. There's 65 million other people, or 65 million people. It's a drop in the bucket. And yet they're highly represented in all these things, like I said, the theater and the journalism and law and medicine. And in politics, Jews are actually quite active across the spectrum. A man named Walter Rathenau, and we're going to see another short video, this time it's for like 2 minutes, was a brilliant industrialist who was very involved in Germany's wartime economy, in organizing the economy, became the foreign minister for Germany in 1922. Unfortunately for him, he was murdered by right-wing assassins. He was shot in his car. He was driving in an open car in Berlin by some nationalist paramilitary organization. Now, you could say it's just another assassination. What was driving it? What was the reason behind it? So if you give me 1 second, call it up, get it on the screen, and then I will share it. Okay. And come here, let's go to share.
Diplomat who saved Germany was murdered for saving Germany. It's 1922, Berlin. A brilliant industrialist has become foreign minister, rebuilding his shattered nation through careful negotiation. Walter Rathenau organized Germany's entire war economy, then switched to peace. He fulfills Treaty of Versailles obligations without resistance, seeking stability over defiance. He signs the Treaty of Rapallo with Soviet Russia, breaking Germany's isolation. Trade routes open, hope returns, and moderate Germans see a future beyond defeat. His pragmatic diplomacy wins respect across Europe. For months, international cooperation seems possible, but right-wing extremists watch in rage. They see a Jewish traitor selling German honor to foreign enemies. Organization Consul terrorists plan their ambush in secret, studying his daily route through Berlin. June 24th arrives. Rathenau rides in his open car, unguarded and confident. The assassins strike on a quiet street, machine guns shattering the morning silence. Germany's most respected statesman dies instantly, his body riddled with bullets meant for a traitor. The same peaceful diplomacy that made him a hero made fanatics see him as Germany's greatest enemy. The diplomat who saved Germany was Walter Rathenau. The diplomat.
So once again, the story that repeats itself thousands of times. Even when a Jew does something good, they're still the enemy. And again, we talk about the right-wing nationalists, paramilitary fanatics. I had the opportunity yesterday to meet with my Rav, who I got smicha from 45 years ago, I guess. He's been living here for 41 years. And Chassidish Rebbe's and Admor and all that business, believe it or not. But at the same time, he's got his head screwed on right. We're talking about the crazies on the right, the crazies on the left, and what they're doing to the country and what they're doing around the world for Jews. Things don't change. Anyways, so there were many, when it came to politics, you had this man, Rathenau, Walter Rathenau, who, for all the good he did, was gunned down because he was Jewish, because he's supposedly selling the honor of Germany. And the stinking Jew is doing that. In addition to many Jews actually sat in the Reichstag, the parliament of the government, in the Social Democrats and the Democrats and other parties. And it seemed on the surface to be fulfilling a promise. The promise was emancipation that the empire partially honored, and now, at least at the beginning, the German Republic, the Weimar Republic, is actually honoring. But we're Jews. We're Jews. And there's always something hovering in the background. And that is the anti-Semitism and what was called the stab in the back myth, which I briefly mentioned last week. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. The Weimar Republic was a particular period in which German anti-Semitism reached a full almost eliminationist form. What does that mean? What was happening was there was the defeat of Germany, the humiliation of Versailles. What was the humiliation in the Treaty of Versailles? Germany became smaller. They weren't allowed to have more than an X amount of soldiers. They weren't allowed to have more than X amount of armaments. They were humiliated by the war. The fear of Bolshevism, social disruption, rapid modernization, all these things together started to feed anti-Jewish hatred. They're always, countries and people are always looking for a scapegoat. Parentheses. The word scapegoat, if you're unaware, comes from a specific situation in Judaism, when on Yom Kippur, the Kohen Gadol would take two animals, that were identical and would have a thread that was tied to one, and thread was tied to Beit HaMikdash. One would be sent out to the desert to be thrown off a cliff and carrying the sins of Bnei Israel. And the other one was being brought as a korban, and he was called the scapegoat because you're putting your sins on the goat, the one of the two goats, the one that gets sent out to the desert, and it was going to be tossed over the edge and get killed. So that was called the scapegoat. So you're trying to have all your sins escape with that animal. So that's where it comes from. So the Jews are the scapegoat century after century after century, and the resurgence of anti-Jewish hatred is actually different in some ways from the social anti-Semitism of the period beforehand. The new anti-Semitism that starts to rear its ugly head, as they say, in the Weimar Republic is racial more than religious. What does that mean? What does it mean, religious anti-Semitism versus racial? So religious anti-Semitism is when give you the classic example is Christian anti-Semitism, wherein the Jews needed to, they killed Christ, or the blood libels, so they had to kill Christian babies to use the blood for matzah. All that has to do with religion. What is the idea of racial anti-Semitism? So now you're going to hear a little bit of something that's going to ring true in your head of what's coming up in the future. That is, it defined Jews as an irredeemable alien race responsible for Germany's every misfortune. It becomes one of the hallmarks of Nazi Germany. We're an alien race. We're irredeemable. We are what will be called, there'll be a lot of German thrown over the next few months, the Untermensch, the subhuman. If you know Yiddish a little bit, then some of the words will pop in here and there within the German will sound familiar to Untermensch, which is under person, or the subhuman. But what was this? Probably one of the biggest causes of anti-Semitism for this reason is going on right now, was the stab in the back legend. I just mentioned that Germany was heavily defeated in World War I. They were humiliated in World War I. Their economy went to pot. Their leadership went to pot. Every single thing that could go wrong for a country went wrong. They lost territory. Just you name it, things went wrong. The myth was that Germany had been defeated not on the battlefield, but by Jews and socialists on the home front, not on the battlefield, but at home in Germany. And that was one of the most destructive lies. It was false. It was false. It wasn't the Jews that, of course, that brought about the destruction of Germany. They were defeated in a military fashion. They blew it on the battlefield. But it was politically irresistible to float this idea because it explained the defeat of Germany without requiring any German to accept responsibility. When you can blame it on the Jews, the government doesn't have to take a responsibility, right? They're not responsible. The Jews were the designated scapegoat, and that lie spread very fast in many ways. Again, think about today, the beginning of the war, when a supposed hospital in Gaza, they have more hospitals in Gaza, they have the whole world combined. They have a hospital where supposedly Israel shot a missile, and originally Hamas said they killed 500 people, then it was 50 people. Oh, it was in a parking lot, and it wasn't even a missile from Israel. It turns out it was, of course, the Hamas or the PIJ, whatever. Their misguided missile that landed locally instead of going into Israel. But Churchill's famous for saying, not at this point yet, that a lie makes it halfway around the world before the truth has time to put its pants on. And it's very true. It's so true that one statement that can be put on AP, the Associated Press, or CNN, or whatever, or the Guardian, or BBC, or the Sky News, all the other media enemies of the Jewish people, the lie spreads instantly. Not as quickly today then as it does now. Now it's instant. But there with the national press or veterans organizations, speeches of politicians, classrooms, teachers who couldn't tell or wouldn't tell the truth to their students. So it was insidious. It was not as fast as things would happen today, but it spread like wildfire. So that the murder of Walter Rathenau in 1922 is partially a direct result of the theory, the myth of the stab in the back, that the Jews stabbed Germany in the back. And now you got this, again, stinking Jew who's giving up the honor of Germany. He's making peace and he's making treaties and he's selling us down the river. And there was a wave of political assassinations. He was one of the more well-known, and disproportionate amount of those assassinations targeted Jews and liberals. They were carried out by paramilitary organizations. A paramilitary, just like you say, a paramedic and a paralegal and all those words means they're not a doctor. They're like a doctor, similar to it. They're not a lawyer, but they're similar to it. They're on their way, potentially. So a paramilitary was not a military of the government. It was a lower level. It was a self-created military with what appeared to be the tacit agreement of the legal system, because right-wing violence was treated with gentle hands. If someone right-wing, very Keatsonian, very extreme, to do something violent, especially if it was against a Jew, courts were not so quick to put somebody in jail, to give them a fine. There was a lot of looking the other way. What was the Jewish response to all this? Again, when we've talked about it over the last many months, when there's been situations of wholesale or institutional anti-Semitism, Jews were ready at this point, and even for the last 100 years maybe, or 50 years before this, are having enough of taking it lying down. So the German Jews responded to the tensions in the Weimar Republic in different ways that had to do with their different ideological approaches. As you can well imagine, you don't have to imagine, after October 7th, by the afternoon of October 8th, there are already divisions in Israel. Yes, everyone's coming together in Kumbaya, and we have to all stand together, except. And all those excepts become a lot of, until today, unfortunately, tremendous schism, a tremendous breach in the social fabric of Israel right now. Each one with their own approach, whether it's probably one of the most, before the war, the most contentious issue had to do with judicial reform. Today, probably the most contentious issue has to do with Haredi conscription, of use into the army. And you have, you have those who, and I guess you'll figure out which side I'm on, is like everyone has to serve. You either serve in the army or you serve in Sherut Leumi, but you serve your country, you do something. We need people learning without a doubt. We need the good learners, the people who can mamish sit all day and learn, and we need every one of those. But those aren't, they need to go into the army. They need to serve. And to the point of some tremendous, very set of ill will feelings between some sides. And the other side, the extreme of Namut v'lo nitgayes. We'd rather die than be conscripted into the army. Because after all, the government is only out to destroy Torah, and the government is like the Tsar of Russia, and all that was shtuyot. So there is the response to October 7th has been different in different communities. Same thing, it's not the same thing. I don't want to compare, but just the concept of each community responding in a different way. When it came to how the German Jews responded to the Weimar Republic's building anti-Semitism, majority of the German Jews were committed to integration. There was a group called the Central Verein, which was the Central Association of German Citizens of Jewish Faith. Long name. They argued very strongly that Jews were full Germans. What do you want to get? What do you have against us? Why are we the scapegoats? Why do you have to blame us? We're German. Secondarily, we're Jews. We're German. You know, the famous question, American Jew, or are you Jewish American? One's the modifier, the adjective, and one is the noun. Which one are you? Which is more important? But the majority of the Jews in the Weimar Republic felt they were full Germans. The anti-Semitism was a pathology of the ignorant. And the answer was patient, legal resistance, and public education. Because if you educate the public about what really anti-Semitism is and how terrible it is, they're all going to come around and we're all going to sit around a campfire and sing and eat uh, Girl Scout cookies. Seems to work. No, never. Not once. This group, the Central Bahrain, monitored anti-Semitic activity. They would bring lawsuits against anti-Semitic publications, and they can maintain an archive of anti-Semitic incidents. And it was probably one of the most historical records that was kept at that time. Today, we have organizations such as honestreporting.com, magnificent organization that has done some great work. The history of the organization begins with the photograph of a Chicagoan and an IDF soldier. If you don't know what I'm talking about, it's absolutely worth looking at it online. So that was the one group. And then you had the German Zionists. Remember, this is the early 1900s. This is already after the early wave of how the pieces now are starting again to come together. This is after the initial waves of Zionism, and whether it was political Zionism, religious Zionism, or social Zionism, but that's in the mid to late 1800s into the early 1900s, where at that point, where there's a solid German Zionist community in the Weimar Republic, and the German Jewish synthesis was, they believed, an absolute delusion. What do you mean German Jewish? What do you mean we are integrated to society? We could never be truly at home in Germany. That's a horrible thing. We're in the diaspora. And the only answer they said to anti-Semitism would be a Jewish national home in Palestine. Remember, I know we are so used to the fact that Baruch Hashem, we have a Medina, we have a state, we have a country, we have where we are. 1922, 1923, 1924, it's still just a dream. And yes, we already know that, of course, that the first Zionist Congress in Basel, which we talked about, and Herzl, and all the ideas of Zionism growth. But it's still just a dream at this point. It's not real. It hasn't happened yet. It's on the way. But this gives the impetus for the German Zionists to say, you see, we cannot be integrated in society. There's no such thing. It'll never work. We need our own home. We need a home for the Jews. The Zionist Federation of Germany was a minority within Jewish Germany, but it was becoming increasingly influential. They read the situation pretty well. But unfortunately, the situation didn't turn out very well for them. It was more accurate than the other organization. The majority of the Jews were looking at full integration. That's how they'd be getting away from anti-Semitism, which, by the way, we've seen already we talked about this months ago in different countries. Oh, we just need to be part of society. All we need to be is this and this and this, and the anti-Semitism will go away because they're going to see how good we are. Unfortunately, the confidence of those German Jews didn't help them very much. Both organizations are grappling with the same basic question, though, and that is, could Jews be safe in Germany? That's both of those Jewish organizations were thinking about that. In 1920s, the question remained open. By 1933, there'd be an answer to that question already. But we're not up to 1933 yet, because we're going to go back. We're not going to go back. We're going to look at a 10-year time period of what became known as the Roaring Twenties, the New World Order, and we'll take a look at that time period, both in terms of history and in terms of the Jews in that time period. I think if you're anything like me, when you come to just tangential knowledge of history, not Jewish, just history, you think of the 1920s and you think of jazz, right? That for some reason that because why? On the surface, the 1920s seemed to be a decade of recovery, prosperity, cultural growth, jazz, movies, movies, modern art, literature. It's like, it sounds like things are booming, right? Beneath the surface, much more difficult. Things were what I call, it's not an original idea. Again, the duck effect. What's the duck? You ever see a duck go across the water. If you look at it, it's very serene, looks beautiful, gliding across the water. But what's going on beneath the surface, right? It's paddling, 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 paddling. And that's what was going on here. On the surface, things look really good, this growth. But underneath the surface, things were not as serene as they look like above. After World War I, there are many attempts to create a lasting peace with international cooperation. I wrote a list of one, two, three, four things. Four things. One, a couple which we've spoken about, most which we have not. In 1921, there was what was called the Washington Naval Conference to limit the size of the power of the navies of every country. In 1925, the Locarno Treaty, which promised that Germany's western borders would be respected. I'm just reading off what I found, and the countries would settle disputes peacefully. In other words, we're trusting the countries that are thinking of destroying each other. They're going to just shake and make up and kiss each other and say, okay, have a good day. 1926, Germany joined the League of Nations. If you remember last week, we talked about the United Nations. United States did not join the League of Nations, but Germany joined them, showing greater international cooperation. And in 1928 was the Kellogg-Briand Pact. It was signed by 62 countries. It rejected war as a way to resolve international disputes. That's like saying we reject food as a way to become hungry, to get over hunger. Because unfortunately, history has shown since almost the dawn of time that nations tend to resolve their differences by war. By 1928, the latter part of this time period, that decade, many people in the world believe that slowly they were moving towards a more peaceful time. Looked like a peaceful future. They have all these different treaties. Things are calming down. There's less problems in the world, more growth. Obviously, sadly, the optimism would be very short and would potentially, not potentially, but would collapse within the next 10 years, completely collapse. The next topic within this, I'm going to move over to the Soviet Union. But I'm going to stop here. I'm going to pick it up next week. I know it's a little bit early, but because the Soviet Union is its own animal. It went from the czarist form of quote government to the Soviet Union, which is a completely new kind of state, which we'll have to talk about. We'll talk about Bezrat Hashem next week. But I don't think I could stress enough, and I've said this probably it's enough point where I don't want to hear this anymore. The sad fact is that we're dealing with a time period which is still considered recent history. The sad fact is that they didn't learn at that time period, the 20s, the 30s, of course, and then in the 40s, late 30s into the 40s, they didn't learn the history and they didn't learn their lessons in the past many, many, many generations. And even within World War II, when we get to it, we'll talk about the Hungarian Jews who turned out to be like the last korbanot for the most part of World War II, the ones who were the most clueless when it came to that they were in the most danger, didn't even realize it. The reason I'm mentioning that, people have accused me sometimes of saying, oh, I say that there's going to be more concentration camps. No, there'll be concentration camps. But things are only going to get worse for the Jews in the diaspora. And we, not just here in Israel, but the world Jewry has the benefit of hindsight of World War II, World War I, the 1800s, the 1700s, the 1600s. I can keep going backwards all the way, where things just don't work out for the Jews in diaspora. And you could just hope and pray that Bezrat Hashem, that maybe for the zchut of us learning all these pieces of Jewish history, that one person will wake up and just make a decision to join us here in Israel. And that's not preachy. That's actually kind of getting on my knees and begging. Get out of here. All right, everybody, have a good evening. And Bezrat Hashem, we shall continue. Thank you very much, Robbie. Appreciate it. All right. Lila Tov. Oh,
thank you.
You're welcome. Public service announcement. If you're in Ma'ale Adumim and Mitzvah Nevo, you have Marav at 7:50 at Pnei Shmuel. All right. Have a good evening.
Good night.
Night.